So recently I got recommended in my YouTube feed Genetically Modified Skeptic's video, Every Feature of Atheist Culture Explained. And I've been feeling pretty complicated about this video. Putting my thoughts into words has been a little difficult, but I wanted to discuss my feelings on it. He seems to be an alright guy, so don't go after him or anything, okay? For those who aren't already in the know, back in the early 2010s, me and my sister were very invested listeners to the atheist skepticism social sphere because of how it was a response to the traumatizing alienation of our ultra-religious community growing up, as well as offering a seemingly sound metaphysical foundation for the existential relationship to the universe founded by scientific realism, naturalism, and truth placed in authority of science. For people like me, who are not scientists but are everyday people, this culture that Skeptic is talking about had a huge impact on our development, and continues to have residual productivity to this day, not just in channels like Skeptics, who are survivors from a previous time, but also new forms, unrecognizable, that derived from this skepticism. The first issue I have with this video really is the claim that this video is describing atheist culture. Obviously this is not true, because many atheists do not feel any connection to this culture that Skeptic describes. Personally, while I was influenced by this culture growing up, I'm still an atheist today, but I don't associate with that specific atheist culture. I would in fact argue that in my case, my atheism has less to do with a belief in God and rather an absence of cultural affiliations, because I don't follow any customs, rituals, or ideas in my atheism, but rather it exists as an absence of these ideas altogether. Personally, the question of the existence of God is not important to me, because sometimes I experience religious experiences while in extreme states of mind, while at other times, like right now, I experience no such experience. Either way, the question is one of a relationship to existence, and not really one that is scientific, which is why the militant atheist mentality presented by Dawkins was so heavily criticized, even by some other atheists. But even if we include the group of people who call themselves atheists online, I don't really believe what Skeptic describes is this culture. What is presented in Skeptic's video is a bunch of nodes that form a social fabric, but what is left out is the complex history and relations that construct what I and many others experienced growing up with this type of atheism. Maybe unintentionally, but Skeptic presents a notion of atheism that doesn't really have a timeline, no sense of past, present, or future projections, where they just exist as interchangeable nodes that can be compartmentalized almost like individual Pokemon, as evident from J.J. McCullough's caricatures. First, these nodes direct almost any potential relationship to this online atheist political movement towards itself. Carl Sagan, for example, was not really a militant atheist like how Richard Dawkins tried to be, but rather was more invested in science education. His interest in skepticism was one rooted in consumer protection, because scientific-sounding symbols were being used to extract money from people who didn't know any better. His efforts were highly distinct from a group like the Four Horsemen, who were a reactionary anti-religious group reacting to the 9/11 attacks, who had very different political motives, but this important difference isn't really made clear in the video. A frustrating aside, but to seriously call Neil deGrasse Tyson the next Carl Sagan is really insulting, and reflects the disconnect between the scientific community and atheist skeptic online presence. Tyson has been extensively criticized in the scientific community for his unprofessional behavior and outright lies to the public about history and science, and doesn't even have particularly remarkable credentials. Anyways, this constant lack of context, which is throughout the video, flattens the atheist skeptic movement into a meaningless description. You really can't watch this video and understand what it means to be an atheist, because the narrative transforms all of these events into a flattened series of nodes. There is almost no timeline of events. It's not clear, for example, how the earlier movements involving characters like Sagan, Randi, and Dawkins transitioned towards the Four Horsemen and other political movements that greatly influenced the online subculture surrounding atheist skepticism, or how magicians like James Randi were instrumental in engaging with the public in a synthesis of criticizing both religious fundamentalism and pseudoscience. Without this context, these nodes are meaningless. To really understand anything about the online politics and even depiction of atheist skeptics online, people have to really understand the relationship that they had with their own political battles. For example, the online atheist skeptic community always suffered from a lot of conflict regarding feminism and minority rights, particularly because many of the men involved in the history of atheist skepticism have bigoted beliefs that they regularly and openly espoused in their shorter works. As an example, Richard Dawkins promoted the science wars, which started in 1992 when two academics wrote an incredibly racist, homophobic book that literally denies climate change and was designed to delegitimize leftist and minority politics in academia by claiming they are anti-science. Is it any surprise that he's a bigot these days? But Skeptic doesn't even really explain Dawkins' criticisms or wrongdoings, giving no context to modern developments. This is why Dawkins coming out as a transphobe was such a surprise to many skeptics, despite him giving warning signs for over 2 decades. This seems to have been done to try to remain neutral in the discussion, to not take a political side. But can one really remain politically neutral in the discussion of atheist skepticism when it has always been a political movement aimed largely at criticizing ultra-conservative Protestant reactionaries and other religious extremists? It is because of this flattening of the narrative into these basic nodes of atheism that Skeptic essentially offers no real answer to his audience. Do you really know if there is an atheist skeptic subculture after watching this video? All we know is that there's a bunch of floating pieces, and this seems to be the fate that the atheist skeptic subculture has suffered. When researching my own video on the history of atheist skepticism, it proved to be much more incredibly difficult to research than, say, the history of Felix Guattari and his political work, because it just seems like almost nobody really cared to chronicle the details. The evidence still exists online, but patching the narrative together has been largely forgotten, perhaps a consequence of the atheist skeptics' insistence on universal, undeniable truths. This has led to the ahistoricization of the atheist skeptic movement, a movement that has had a tremendous impact on the internet since its inception. Its influence and remnants survive in many forms that are generally imperceptible as atheist skeptic, such as the way we engage with arguments online or how many of us shape what we believe as true. What is problematic to me is that there is no understanding with the majority of remaining atheist skeptics where these ideas actually came from. Skeptic shows us a world of atheist skepticism where each category is merely a light flashing in a void, with no context, meaning, or understanding beyond simply an array of signifiers. There is no connection to reality anymore. While his first attempt is important just as a means to get basic connection of these signs in the minds of people, more work needs to be done to communicate the details of this history and narrative.